Chapter 22. Ruins of the Ancient City of Shiyi. Ever since we encountered the fierce black sandstorm around noon, we had followed the white camel into the ruins of this unnamed city within the sea of sand. The broken city seemed wrapped in a layer of mystery from the inside out, leaving me unsure whether danger lay concealed beneath. As such, I continued to remain alert, even as others took their rest. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a slight movement in the eyes of the stone statue. Despite the distance and dim indoor lighting, I trusted my eyesight and stood up to check the stone figure with the giant pupils by the wall. The gas lamp hanging from the roof beam swayed erratically from the winds blasting the broken house, creating a flickering light that made the dilapidated house alternately bright and dark. The black stone figure appeared like a corpse half buried, with only the head exposed above the sand. Upon closer examination, I found it was merely a large ant lying on the statue's eye, about the size of a finger joint, with a dark body and blood-red tail. A glimmer appeared as the lamp's light briefly hit it, giving the illusion that the stone figure's eye was flashing from a distance. I realized it was just an ant and flicked it to the floor, squashing it with my foot, hearing a soft crunch. Oddly, the ant's body was much harder than expected. Looking around, the breeze flowed through the tattered building, but it was unclear where the ant had crawled in from. Shirley Young approached, asking what had happened, and I casually mentioned it was nothing significant, just an ant I had stepped on. I woke Fatty, who was deep in sleep, and assigned him to stand watch. Then, I added some solid fuel to the fire to make it blaze and extinguished the gas lamp before crawling into my sleeping bag. Exhaustion quickly took me, and when I woke, it was already past 9 in the morning. The sandstorm had howled through the entire night, yet its force had considerably weakened, signaling the impending end to this devilish storm. The ancient city's ruins were further claimed by the yellow sands, with fewer parts still visible above the surface. If hit by another couple of such storms, I feared this nameless city might vanish into the desert entirely. However, its burial by the sands didn't signify it was forever lost. As much of the Taklamakan is a shifting desert, and the city may resurface years from now as the sands move with the wind. Professor Hal-I Guo was overseeing the students' excavation of the stone figure, which was uncovered to the thighs, and everyone gathered to observe. Only Anlaman took the chance, as the wind subsided, to check on the camels hiding beneath the city walls. I took some dry food from my bag and munched while observing their digging. My reason for accompanying the archaeological team into the desert was not only to ascertain the presence of any large tombs, but also to gain some archaeological expertise from these specialists. They were cautious to avoid damaging the engravings on the stone figure, using entrenching tools to excavate the surrounding sand before careful brushing and cleaning. Every part uncovered was cleaned section by section, and everything was meticulously recorded. When Professor Chen saw me awake, he nodded in greeting, appearing to have recovered well. He informed me that the current work was for the students to get some hands-on practice and gain practical experience. Though theoretical knowledge was important, fieldwork was crucial in archaeology. Having a direct, tactile engagement with the site allows for a more vivid understanding that, when tied to theory, can greatly accelerate learning. Before long, the students had uncovered the pedestal of the giant pupil stone statue. I had never seen such a figure before. It was adorned in what seemed to be Turkic attire, with arms draped along its sides and many intricate patterns engraved on its body that resembled some kind of tantric scripture. Professor Chun mentioned that these symbols had never been deciphered, yet advancements in archaeological research in recent years led experts to believe that these might represent some sort of code or symbols conveying information about ancient religious practices. The reason for inscribing these symbols onto the stone figure might be related to rites of worship. Unfortunately, there were no surviving records, documentary paintings, or historical accounts to shed light on the symbols, leaving us with mere speculation at this point. Sudi Peng, who had been listening to Professor Chen's explanation, ventured a hypothesis. "Professor, the design of this stone figure is vastly different from ordinary people. I wonder if there's a possibility that in ancient times there was a religion that worshipped aliens. After encountering extraterrestrials, they came to view them as divine beings and created figures like this to worship, and maybe these symbols on the stone figure are an extraterrestrial language." Halaigua immediately rebuked him. Suddy, you're known for not being studious, and I've told you many times. You're a smart kid. Don't waste your brains on absurd ideas. How did you come up with aliens? We have to approach history and archaeology with seriousness. Professor Chen, rather than being upset, displayed an affectionate smile. Having imagination is not a bad thing. Being young and having an active mind is good. After all, the principle in archaeology and historical studies is to make bold hypotheses, but validate them cautiously. Imagination has to be grounded in reality, otherwise it's unreliable. Let's consider the giant pupil stone statue. Ancient people like to use astronomical phenomena to predict fortune and disaster. Maybe at night as they gazed at the star-filled sky, they wished they could see further. Is it possible that when creating the stone statues, they infused them with such a desire? It's quite plausible, as some figures unearthed in Sangsingdui and Sichuan also have elongated eyes, which could symbolize an ancient expression of their desire to explore. Hearing this point in the discussion left me in admiration. Clearly, Professor Chun was on a whole different level. His erudition made Halaigua's condemnation seem shallow by comparison. Professor Chun continued, suggesting that the possibility of extraterrestrials is not entirely outside the scope of reality. Rather than being a mere fabrication of foreign science fiction, the earliest records of extraterrestrials are actually found in our own ancient Chinese texts and wall paintings. Over 7,500 years ago, the rock art of the primitive tribes in Helan Mountains depicted images of astronauts emerging from a large disk, with animals and residents scattering in all directions. Scenes likely beyond the ancient humans' imaginative capabilities, probably intending to record a significant disaster or event. Such accounts appear in records dating to the Zhou and Xia dynasties and in some ancient books. Just then, Anlaman returned through the sandy wind blowing through the rooftop hole, announcing that the sandstorm was on the verge of passing. He said the skies would clear within half an hour by the grace of Allah and noted how the sandstorm had nearly overwhelmed the city's outer walls. Without his reassurance, worries lingered, as it was unclear when the wind would completely cease. With Anlaman's words, everyone's concerns eased, and they focused attentively on Professor Chen's lecture, while I brewed a pot of tea, preparing for us to continue on our journey afterward. Right as the tea came to a boil, the group surrounding the giant pupil stone figure screamed in unison and jumped back, startled by an unexpected swarm of large ants. With a mound of sand rising and bursting forth like a fountain, numerous giant ants emerged. People tried to squash them with shovels, killing hundreds at a stroke, but thousands more kept surging from the sand, a sight that made one's scalp prickle. Initially assumed to be a disturbance of an anthill caused by the digging, it quickly became evident this was not the case. The ground was now riddled with over a dozen large holes, with ever more ants, each with a dark body and red tail, crawling out in inexhaustible waves. Anlaman glanced at the scene and then fled away. Others tried to fight off the ants with shovels, but within moments, the ants became too numerous to handle. Shirley Yang, a well-traveled photographer from National Geographic, urgently warned everyone to climb to the rooftop to escape the desert army ants, which could reduce a person to a skeleton in no time. Millions of the ants filled half of the room, with more and more crawling out consistently, not only from the ground but also spilling from the ceiling and walls. The terrifying sight rendered some, including Professor Chin and Ye Yixin, completely immobilized by fear. Even Fatty and I, hardened by various experiences, were trembling at the fearful sight of the army ants, suspecting the skeleton in the room we found was likely the ants' handiwork. They left nothing behind but bones. Attempting to calm myself, I noted Anlaman had fled again. It was maddening. Him always the first to run from danger after promising to share the same fate with us just the day before. Rushing to act before it was too late, I knocked over the fire I had been tending to, spilling solid fuel to create a barrier of flames, scorching the approaching ants and temporarily halting their advance. But the sheer number of ants and their relentless march toward the flame made their extinguishing a matter of time. I urged everyone to grab what we could carry and, pulling one another along, we made it out of our shelter. Outside, the storm had significantly weakened. The ruins of the ancient city were now a frenzy of wildlife. Animals like gazelles, wild camels, sandwolves, desert mice, and crested ibises all in a panicked dash. Many places were erupting with desert army ants swarming those too slow to escape. The ants, armed with powerful formic acid, could devour even the largest of creatures. After they'd passed, nothing was left but bleached bones. Our struggle was not just against the ants within the room. It felt as if the entire ancient city had turned into a colossal anthill, trapping us on the rooftop with only our shovels to fend off the climbing army ants. At a distance, under the city walls, Anlaman was busily untying the camels. I passed the rifle to Fatty and told him, "Shoot his hat off." Without hesitation, Fatty aimed at Anlaman's head and fired, his shot blowing Anlaman's hat off and causing him to instinctively duck and look back up toward us on the rooftop. I shouted down to Anlaman, "Old man, if you try to run, the next shot will be for your backside, and Allah surely won't mind." Anlaman waved his hands in the air, signaling he wouldn't run away. But as the desert army ants had flooded the shelter below, we had no way of getting down from the roof. In the midst of our confusion, part of the crumbling wall collapsed, revealing a giant ant, likely the queen, crawling out from within. This one was equipped with 6 pairs of large, transparent wings, presumably stirred by the sandstorm, preparing her colony for relocation. The sight of the ant queen's formidable presence changed the expressions on the faces of the archaeological team. Shirley Young urged, "Get the leader, and the rest will scatter. Shoot it." Despite the small caliber of the sporting air rifle making it ineffective against the queen ant, Fatty fired anyway, unloading the remainder of the magazine at the target. Taking my scarf, I wrapped up the leftover solid fuel, lit one end with my lighter, and hurled it like an incendiary bomb down at the queen. To our surprise, the tactic worked. The fire engulfed the queen, who thrashed in pain, rolling in the sand and fueling it further. Such compressed fuel burns intensely, and with half a kilogram or so left, the fire grew larger, throwing the surrounding ants into disarray as they desperately tried to extinguish the flames. Seizing the opportunity, I signaled everyone to make a run for it. Holding my entrenching tool, I led the way, dispersing the scattered ants, while Tujan carried Professor Chan on his back. Halaikua, Yi Shin, and the others helped each other along, with Fatty covering our retreat. We all burst out of the breach towards safety. Anlaman, having controlled the frightened camels, guided everyone mount up and urged the camel caravan onward out of the city. All around us, various creatures were escaping the chaos, unconcerned with their usual territorial battles. After a few hundred meters, I looked back to see the remains of the ancient city, nothing more than a memory as countless army ants boiled out from the ground like a stirred black and red sea. But as long as we weren't surrounded by them, we were safe. Anlaman justified his actions by saying that he had tried to untie the camels to prevent them from being devoured by the ants, not simply to flee himself. Fatty was skeptical, suggesting Anlaman could explain it to his rifle next time. Anlaman's excuse seemed plausible, and I didn't want to argue further, considering the desert's many challenges ahead of us, so I intervened to prevent further debate. I reminded Anlaman, together, we witnessed the auspicious white camel and escaped the desert army ant's siege. All by Allah's will. He considers us brothers, faithful believers, and I trust you. Those who betray friends and brothers will be punished by Allah. Anlaman agreed fervently, "Praise Allah. Allah is the one true God. We are indeed the best of friends and brothers, and surely Allah will bless us." This whole escapade, significant yet hazard-free, had concluded, and who knew what challenges awaited us beyond the deep sands surrounding the ancient city of Shiyi City. Still, I knew I had to find a way to persuade Professor Chun and the others to turn back. We were less than half a day's journey from the ruins of Shiyi City. The wind had died down, and the sun hung in the sky like a fiery orb. In the desert, the most critical thing is to maintain enough water supply, and although it's usually ill-advised to travel during the day due to the heat, our water reserves were plentiful. We prepared to replenish at Shiyi City, so we pressed on under the scorching sun. The desert in daylight has a beauty of its own. The Darim Basin, shaped by ancient orogenic movements of the West Himalaya Range, gave Xinjiang a bowl-like geography, filled to the brim with a bowl of golden sand. In this vast, boundless ocean of sand. Our small caravan of 9 people and 19 camels appeared insignificant. The ratio was even less than 1 in 10,000 of the grains in this bowl of gold. Despite this vast emptiness, if not for our long footprints stretching behind us, one could barely feel the progress being made. It made me admire the solitude of explorers who ventured into the desert or Gobi alone. Perhaps only in such loneliness, between heaven and earth, one could truly grasp the meaning of life. Despite this admiration, such a life was not for me. I much preferred being part of a group. Suddy Pong and the others, brimming with curiosity, engaged Shirley Yang in conversation as we trekked, listening to her tell of the desert army ants she had heard of but never seen. Of villages ravaged by the ants, leaving only bones behind in a gruesome display. These ants are called army ants due to their high level of organization and discipline, resembling a military unit that, aside from mobility and firepower, can't be compared in coordination to any human army. As we walked and talked, the dunes rose and fell beneath our feet more than ever before. Anlaman revealed that the dense dunes likely concealed ancient cities buried in yellow sand. He led us to the summit of the highest dune and pointed southward, indicating our midpoint station, the ruins of Shiyi City. Looking through my binoculars toward the south, I beheld an oasis nestled in the heart of the sandy sea. The oasis in the desert appeared like an emerald set atop a golden platter, with the silhouette of blackened city ruins rising from its center. The remains of Shiyi City were well preserved. The city survived until the late Tang dynasty when it was devastated by fire, and then abandoned ever since. In the early 19th century, German explorers found this site, pillaging most of its valuable frescoes and statues. Since then, only the empty city remains beside the oldest channel of the Peacock River, which marks its endpoint. Because underground water flows through the city all year round, it became a vital supply point for desert travelers. Our caravan descended from the high dunes, slowly making its way toward the oasis. Anlaman suggested we rest a few days at Shiyi City before venturing further into the Black Desert, since it would be difficult to turn back once we entered. The camels, already spooked and burdened with heavy supplies, required rest to recover their strength before we could set off again. His suggestion aligned perfectly with my own intentions. I was hoping for a pause that might provide the chance to convince the archaeological team to return home instead of pursuing the elusive Jingjue. I had been feeling increasingly weary, and taking further ventures into deeper desert regions spelled potential disaster. There was no guarantee our previous luck would hold. Slowing down my camel's pace next to Professor Chun, I proposed a plan. "Professor, what do you think if we stay in Shiyi City for 3 to 5 days, maybe 6 days, before proceeding?" Anlaman says the camels are exhausted, and unless we let them rest enough, we might have to switch to Plan 11. Professor Chin, puzzled, inquired, "What, Plan 11? How does one execute that?" I replied, "Professor, how do you not know about Plan 11? It's walking on 2 legs. With that, I used my fingers to mimic walking legs. Isn't this Plan 11? Professor Chun burst into laughter. "Who, my dear friend? Where do you come up with these novel expressions? Quite interesting indeed. All right, let's stay and rest well here for a few days. I was thinking of taking a good look at the ruins of this famous city anyway." From the sand dunes, the oasis seemed close, yet it took us 3 full hours to reach it. The city walls, built from black stones, had partially collapsed and weathered, showing significant damage. Only the main city structure was relatively intact, vaguely retaining its past splendor. Various groups like oil workers, explorers, and geological survey teams stayed in the main city when passing by, blocking the doors with stones to protect against wolf attacks. Since the expansive wolf hunts of the mid-1970s in Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, large wolf packs have disappeared, leaving only smaller groups or solitary wolves, which pose little threat. Besides, our number was strong, and we were armed. So there was little concern of wolves, especially since we were the only souls visiting the spot during the windy season. We found a spacious room within the main city, lit a campfire, and prepared food and tea. Anlaman and I located an ancient well within the city. Legend said the well had never run dry in thousands of years. Anlaman held it as a miracle from Allah, to which I remained non-committal. Using a leather bucket, We dropped it deep into the well, attaching it to a long rope measuring several tens of meters before hearing the sound of water. I tasted the water first, its chilling touch instantly cooling the fiery sensation from the desert's scorching sun. A refreshment beyond words. We watered all 19 camels at the well side, giving them salt licks and bean cakes before hauling 2 large buckets back to the room where the archaeological team rested. Exhausted, they slept on the ground. Some even dozed off mid-bite into their flatbread. I let them sleep undisturbed. It had been a demanding few days. After boiling a large pot of water, I woke the team members, Professor Chin among them, one by one. I urged them to soak their blistered feet in the hot water and then pricked open the blisters for them. Only after ensuring everyone was taken care of did I allow myself to sleep, and I drifted off into a heavy slumber, my worn body finally finding restoration. That evening, we gathered to listen to Fatty's entertaining boasts. Fatty was quite the chatterbox, regaling everyone with tales of how bountiful the forests of the Northeast were, boasting about the deliciousness of the game and foraged foods there, contrasting it starkly with the desert where all one finds is sand and more sand and harsh winds. He spoke fondly of the greater and lesser Shingon ranges, where, according to an old saying, one could simply strike pheasants with a stick or scoop fish from rivers without even trying, painting the image of a hunter's easy life. The less experienced students were captivated by Fatty's stories until Suddy Pong, pushing his glasses up his nose, curiously asked, "Brother Wong, what does striking pheasants with a stick mean? Do you really hit them with a stick?" Fatty replied, "Glasses, you seem eager to learn, so I'll explain. It means that you could walk in the mountains, swing any old stick, and accidentally strike down a pheasant, or just use a gourd to scoop fish from a river. It's a way to say that food is plentiful there." Shirley Young scoffed at Fatty's exaggeration. The desert has its own advantages. The variety of plant and animal life in the desert is no less abundant than in forests. Besides, the Taklamakan Desert, while being the lowest point of a basin, was a peak of ancient civilization in its own right. What else can you find in forests besides deer and bears? Fearing the two might start quarreling, I quickly suggested we step outside saying, "Let's not fuss in front of a lady. Let's you and I go out for a smoke instead." As I spoke, I led Fatty outside. Under the night sky, painted by a picturesque moon and a tapestry of stars that cast a silvery glow over the land, I lit a cigarette for Fatty and urged him to be more considerate towards Shirley Young. He said of course he wouldn't stoop to her level, stating that Americans didn't understand certain things, but we couldn't be like that. Moreover, she's a woman. If it were a man, I would have twisted his head off and used it as a football already. I laughed and agreed, telling him, "Absolutely right. Who are you? With just a single pea, you'd corrode a hole in the cement. You better be the bigger person. Don't go pulling Shirley Yang's head off, or else where would we go for our payment? $20,000 is not a small sum." Having shared a few laughs, I looked up and blew a smoke ring, then noticed in the sky the giant stars of Jumin, Zhufu, and Yubai, shining brightly and forming a perfect equilateral triangle, with the Taishang and Taiyin stars in the center. A splendid arrangement of fortunate stars in Qin's armor, reference to astrological symbols in Chinese metaphysics. I had never delved deeply into celestial feng shui before. It was only in the aims of earning some extra money with the archaeological team that I had reluctantly gone through the materials multiple times. Now, as I observed the sky, the content from the celestial volume of feng shui techniques immediately came to mind. I hurried back into the shelter to get a compass and climbed to the top of the city wall, aligning with the constellation to pinpoint the auspicious spot right above the ancient well in the city. This was my first application of celestial feng shui, and although I wasn't entirely confident, it seemed likely that I wasn't mistaken. The 16 characters of Yin and Yang feng shui, which my family possessed, was no ordinary book, suggesting that there must be a tomb near this underground water flow. There is a concept of hugging the water in burial practices, but whether it should be this close was debatable. Regardless, this was a significant discovery that I needed to share with the archaeological team. If they found something here, they might not feel compelled to venture into the Black Desert. Overjoyed, Professor Chun, accompanied by the excited students, rushed to the well's edge, intent on descending to see what lay below. The well's railings and winch had been recently replaced since the original ones had been destroyed long ago. Anlaman attempted to stop everyone, claiming the well was sacred and Allah forbade mortals from descending. However, Hal-i-Gua pulled Anlaman aside and lectured him about the policies of archaeology, explaining that excavation is meant to better preserve and leave this cultural treasure for the people. With numerous tomb raiding incidents in Xinjiang, including those by foreigners, it's essential for government intervention to prevent the loss of these precious artifacts. After discussing with Shirley Yang, we decided to set up a double-knot safety harness to lower someone down and assess what lay beneath. I volunteered to go down. Though there was a water flow beneath, one couldn't be too careful. I donned an anti-poison mask, flashlight, whistle, entrenching tool, dagger, secretly hid a donkey's hoof and a talisman for touch gold sign, tested the rope strength, and arranged signals. If I shone the flashlight upwards 3 times, those above would stop lowering the rope. Shining the flashlight twice meant pulling me up. Whistle signals were decided upon as backups if the flashlight was not visible. By now, Hal-i-Gua had convinced Anlaman, who, along with Chu Jin and Fatty, would lower me into the well. Carefully, they let down the rope, and I began my descent into the well's depths. It was evening, and aside from the light of a flashlight, darkness enveloped us. As I made my descent into the well, the chill of the desert night, paired with the well's humidity, chilled me to the bone. The slippery walls offered no foothold, making the journey downwards even more treacherous. Rumor had it that this ancient well predated Shi city itself, suggesting the city was built around this water source. Suddenly, a draft alerted me to a stone door set into the well wall. After signaling and securing the cooperation of those above, I approached the entrance. The door was thick with no visible lock, and despite its large gap, it wouldn't budge. It required a prying tool to open. When no further ingress seemed possible, I signaled to be pulled back up. Once above, I relayed the findings to Professor Chun, who found it curious. Was this some secret passage rather than a tomb, given the unusual location next to a well? Fatty eagerly volunteered to descend and pry open the stone door, but considering the weight issue and our need to preserve the rope, I decided to go back down myself. We constructed a rope ladder to facilitate access once the door was opened. Professor Chin, Shirley Yang, Suddy Pong, and I were chosen to venture into the depths, leaving Fatty and the others above. After a considerable effort to force open the door, which had likely not been used for centuries, I found myself leading the way down a brick and stone passageway of substantial construction that disappeared into total darkness beyond. Calling Shirley Yang and the others down after me, we proceeded into the depths, armed with preventative medicine for hypoxia and donning our protective gear. Around 50 meters beyond, we passed through 2 stone doors, with the final one tightly sealed, adorned with carvings of unknown beasts and sealed with animal hides that we carefully removed. At corridor's end, we entered a spacious and dry stone chamber, roughly 60 to 70 meters in length and width, and 3 meters high. Here, the atmosphere was anything but comforting. The floor was covered in animal bones, and numerous wooden pillars encircled the room, each bearing the desiccated remains of humans, all appearing to be adult men. Professor Chen, Shirley Yang, and I, all seasoned from our various experiences, felt more fascinated than fearful at this mysterious place, whereas Suddy Pong was petrified upon seeing the numerous mummified corpses clinging closely to the professor's side. Shirley Yang observed the mummified corpses and sighed, expressing sorrow for the likely slaves or prisoners who met such a barbaric fate through ritual sacrifice. Professor Chen explained to the group that this seemed to be a place for performing rituals for important deceased individuals, following the ancient customs of Puemo. He theorized that these people were likely criminals who had been deliberately tied and left to die of thirst in the desert, mummified by the wind, and then placed here. Next, animals would be slaughtered, and their fresh blood poured over the dry bodies. He suggested searching the area for a tomb chamber. We circled the chamber, examining the area. It was encased by solid stone walls that seemed to have no hidden spaces when knocked upon. It was Shirley Yang's keen observation that led us to discover that the floor of the stone chamber was unusual. I cleared the scattered bones on the ground to reveal a large stone slab with reliefs and 2 pull rings at the ends. I called Suddy Pong to help me lift the slab, but seeing him trembling with fear made me chuckle. So I sent him back to the surface to prevent further fright and to swap with Hal Igwa, who seemed interested in the eerie tomb. Suddy Pong hurried back up as if he were pardoned while Professor Chin half-jokingly admonished the boy for being too faint-hearted for archaeology. Together, Shirley Yang and I pulled open the stone slab, and I tossed in a cold firework to illuminate what was below. We revealed a tomb chamber about the same size as the one above, with a square coffin at the center. Its design was unusual, not decorated with patterns and not rectangular like typical coffins but rather square, resembling a large box. Such burial forms and caskets were not something I, or even the erudite Professor Chin, had ever seen before. This was likely an ancient form of burial for a minority group, heavily influenced by Han culture yet distinct, mixing in many effects of their own and exceedingly rare. Just then, Hal Igor arrived with Chu Jan, and upon seeing the scene below, they became so excited their eyes practically gleamed. Hal Igor, who I always thought of as stern and serious, was now like an eager child, curious and animatedly examining everything, full of anticipation. We all descended into the tomb chamber, and upon seeing the surroundings, couldn't help but utter gasps of awe at the sight of the exquisite colored murals covering all the walls of the tomb. Professor Chen, upon investigating one of the murals, could hardly contain his excitement. This painting is related to Jingjue. While I was eager to find valuable burial goods, the sizable coffin hinted at potentially rich contents, which, although not to be taken away in front of the professors, warranted a look to sate my curiosity. This tomb seemed to be more luxurious than the general's tomb at Black Wind Pass that I had hoped to be rich. However, Professor Chun was absorbed in interpreting the murals rather than inspecting the coffin. Patiently, I waited and listened as he explained the mural's content to Hal Guo and others. The mural in the front depicted the life of a prince from the vassal state Puimo under Jingjue. Oppressed and having contributed vast treasures and slaves annually, the prince repeatedly sought the Jingjue queen's audience to plead for his people's freedom but was denied each time. The prince, unwilling to give up and believed to be the incarnation of the Sun War god, ventured into Jingjue alone with the intent to assassinate the evil queen only to discover a great secret. Intrigued by Professor Chen's words, I moved closer along with Shirley Yang and others to hear his detailed interpretation. Professor Chen, studying another mural, noted, "This is quite peculiar. Look at this painting. The prince is hiding in the corner, spying on the queen's face. In all other murals, the queen's face is veiled, but in this one, the queen's back is to us, and as she lifts her veil with one hand, the figure opposite her, which seems to be a slave, turns into a shadow and vanishes." I was confused and about to ask for clarification when Shirley Yang said, "The queen is some kind of monster." Monster? Professor Chen paused for a moment, then asked Shirley to elaborate on her thoughts. Shirley pointed to the mural and explained. The artist who painted these murals had exceptional skills, creating a lavish yet lifelike composition. Though there are no textual explanations, the characteristics in the painting are vivid. We can visually sense and understand the significant events and figures of Prince Pumo's life. Listening to her and examining the murals closely, I could see that her descriptions were accurate, with figures, costumes, buildings, and expressions all expertly rendered. For those familiar with Western region's culture, these details provide a strong grasp of the historical context depicted in the murals. Shirley Yang continued her explanation, addressing the enigmatic mural that Professor Chen had highlighted as the most challenging to comprehend. She described a scene where the Queen of Jingjue, always veiled in other depictions, reveals her face only for her adversary to become a series of dashed lines, a mere contour hinting at a vanishing existence. When I interjected with a question, wondering if the painting implied that the individual disappeared upon gazing upon the Queen's face, Shirley Yang confirmed my interpretation, suggesting that the Queen's gaze caused the person to vanish. I shook my head and chuckled bitterly at the notion of a person simply vanishing into thin air by merely looking at someone. A living person disappears just like that? It's disappeared? That's too inconceivable. Honestly, I'm having a hard time grasping this, I said. However, Professor Chun seemed to grasp Shirley Yang's point and encouraged her to continue. Shirley shared that her speculation was not unfounded, as her father used to read the Great Tang records on the western regions by the Tang dynasty monk Xuanzang, which she had also perused several times. The book contains many legends of the western regions, some mythical and others based on actual events, including the tale of a desert queen whose eyes acted as a gateway to the netherworld. A glance from her could make her enemies disappear without a trace, never to return. The queen, known for her tyrannical rule, demanded divine worship from the neighboring country's inhabitants, sentencing all dissenters to live flayings. Potentially having angered the divine, she soon fell ill and passed away. Following her death, the slaves, along with several oppressed nations, formed an alliance and overthrew her city, intending to destroy her tomb. At that moment, the colors of heaven and earth changed as a terrible sandstorm swallowed the city and the allied forces, burying the queen's tomb and treasures under the sand. Centuries later, with the shifting sands of the desert, the city resurfaced. Travelers passing by who took anything were said to invoke desert storms, becoming lost and trapped forever. While the mystic city, the wicked queen, and the era's precise context are not distinctly chronicled, the murals we found in the tomb today strikingly resembled this ancient legend. Such parallels suggest that the lore might not be entirely a myth and could indeed represent events that, now buried by time, once happened. Shirley Yang encouraged everyone to examine the subsequent murals, which provided evidence that the depicted queen was indeed the Queen of Jingjue, recognized by the distinctive attire of the Jingjue people, their unique architectural styles, and the decorative artifacts, all of which strongly corroborated her theory. She pointed out that the later murals confirmed her conjecture, clearly illustrating the story of the prince who, having failed to assassinate the queen, continued to conspire her downfall upon his return home. A soothsayer from a distant land advised him to hide a slow-acting poison in a golden lamb, which he then presented to the queen. Sure enough, news of the queen's sudden death followed shortly after. Meanwhile, the prince, strained by his exertions, also passed away prematurely and was buried alongside his beloved wife. The soothsayer designed a tomb for them, which was placed beneath the altar of the sacred well. These events were seemingly predestined, with the altar being built before the tomb chamber. The portrayal of events in the mural aligned closely with the legend from the book, surprising everyone with their similarity, suggesting that such tales may not be entirely fictional. Observing Professor Chen's satisfaction and relief over Shirley's rooted knowledge in archaeology despite being a photographer, and recalling a friend who disappeared into the depths of the desert, he was moved with emotion. Shirley Yang reassured Professor Chen, "Please take care of yourself, don't be too sad. We've made significant, substantive progress in understanding the Jingjue relics. I believe we will soon find the ancient city of Jingjue. My father, if he's watching over us, would rest in peace." Even though I had hoped that discovering an ancient tomb would make the team turn back, it seemed they were now determined to continue the search. If only I had pretended not to see these clues at the beginning. Recalling Shirley Yang's earlier comments that described the Queen of Jingjue as both a breathtaking beauty and a monster, I inquired, "Miss Yang, I remember you mentioning that the Queen was considered the most beautiful woman in the western regions, in whose presence other women would pale as stars to the sun. How then do you also refer to her as a monster? If she were truly a monster, wouldn't we be facing death by seeking her tomb?" Shirley Yang responded, "All these stories are just legends combined with our deductions and don't necessarily represent the factual truth. Archaeology is about piecing together legends, historical records, and unearthed artifacts with scholarly speculation. The more information we gather, the closer we get to historical truth. But what we can do is only to come infinitely close to the real story. No history can be fully restored. In ancient times, people's understanding of the world was limited. Phenomena that are common to us now were often exaggerated into demons, monsters, or miracles. Even today, with the advancement of science, there are still phenomena that science cannot explain. I believe this doesn't mean that gods or demons exist, but rather that our scientific inquiry is not yet comprehensive enough. In time, I'm sure science will find explanations for all these unanswered mysteries." I further inquired, How should we understand the tale of the Jingjue queen who could cause people to vanish with her gaze, given today's advanced science and civilization? Shirley Young responded, Mr. Hu, have you heard about an extraordinary case at the Center for Special Phenomena and Pathology in Kansas, USA? There was a 12-year-old boy with a peculiar ability. If he stared for an extended time at an object less than 5 centimeters in diameter, it would just disappear, as though evaporated into thin air. His neighbors considered him an oddity, even calling him a monster. His parents were deeply troubled and hoped that the government could cure their child. This intrigued me, as I had never heard such a thing, especially since I knew little about China itself, let alone the strange tales from the United States. How could this boy's condition be explained? It seemed eerily similar to the legend of the monstrous queen. Was the child eventually healed? Shirley elaborated. Scientists discovered that the boy's brainwaves were abnormal. His neural activity and vision generated a form of energy that interfaced with what they called an imaginary space, a dimension beyond our perception. Such unique abilities occur in 1 out of 3 billion people. Eventually, a researcher found a way to address his condition by crafting a magnetic helmet. After a year of using the helmet, the boy's extraordinary abilities disappeared. The U.S. military had once planned to secretly transfer this child to a military research facility, but when the plan leaked, it caused public outrage, forcing the military to abandon their plans. I mulled over this story with a degree of skepticism. The ancient evil queen of the tales was perhaps not so simple as the American boy's case. If we really found the queen's ancient tomb, what would we do if faced with her transformative gaze? Resolving to take things step by step, I mentally prepared to use strong measures to bring the team back if danger arose. Who dared to defy orders? I didn't believe these scholars could outmuscle me, who, after all. As this lengthy discussion and exploration of the murals wrapped up, I asked Professor Chen, shall we examine the contents of the coffin next?